Hi folks, this is Tom Horn coming to you once again from the beautiful Studio A here at the Skywatch television facilities in Missouri. And once again, I've got my good friend, Dr. Micheal Lake. Welcome to the show again.
It's good to be back, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, on the last program, we both commented after it was over how it felt like we'd only been talking 4 or 5 minutes. We were really just kind of barely scratching the surface. But I want to pick it back up where we were talking about this conspiratorial world view. You know, I read an article not long ago where it said, as it turns out, a lot of the conspiratorists are correct in their view of the world and the machinations of government, agencies and some of the wars that we have fought over time. Turns out that what people laughed at one time and said, oh, you're just a conspiracy nut job, turned out to actually be true. But what you've done in this book, the Shinar Directive, is that you've taken this to a whole new level. You're saying it isn't just some war that the CIA may have been involved with. We're talking about a cosmic level conspiracy that's been playing out since ancient times and that is directly connected to what Nimrod had done in the land of Shinar, things that actually happened to Nimrod himself, which we'll talk about in a few moments. And these old fellows called the Watchers, these powerful angelic beings that came down to the earth, and as I understand it, among other things, tinkered with the genetic makeup of all life on earth, plants, animals, humans, everything. I mean, we'll get into, why were they doing that. But one of the questions that has bothered theologians since forever, and Bible students wrestle with this all the time. I get emails about it all the time. How were there giants on the earth before the flood, but also after the flood? And we have this new movie came out not long ago on Noah. It's just a ridiculous mess of a movie. It's got the giants helping Noah build the ark and just all kind of crazy ideas. But it hinted that there might have been something on the ark, perhaps one of Ham's wife or something, and the Noah character is thinking he might have to kill her. And it didn't really go into the details, but I know it plays into some of this conspiratorial thought that maybe she was a carrier of the seed, and then maybe some other kind of ideas. But you talk in here, in your book, The Shinar Directive, about one of the possible situations that allowed for knowledge, right? I mean, something was stowed away on the ark.
I was trying to follow the esoteric knowledge. Now, there's several good theories about how there were Nephilim before and after. It could be a reincursion of the Watchers. It could also be that the wives might have had Nephilim DNA encoded within their genetics. But I was trying to follow the knowledge because there had to be more than just birthing Nephilim to do what they were going to do. And one of your mentors, Dr. Thomas had wrote about how that there were universities that the Watchers and the Nephilim have founded that predate the flood. And I have kind of wondered, since you follow it, it erupts in the heart of Ham after they get on the other side. I wondered if he didn't take that knowledge with him on the ark, because the devil loves to always have that extra seed, that extra stowaway. And it begins to explode in the heart of Ham. We see that with the sin against his father Noah. And one of the things that I have found, anybody who ever begins getting into esoteric knowledge, one of the first manifestations is this haughtiness, this pride that they have. And that manifests in the heart of Ham, that when Noah gets drunk after partying because of their celebration of their first harvest, instead of covering his father's nakedness, he goes and begins to proclaim it throughout the camp. And that is a symptom of having esoteric knowledge within your soul and the pride that goes with it. And then he began to build through his children the empire that his grandchildren built. Egypt, they built Babylon. It became a family endeavor for them to begin working something other than what God wanted in the earth.
And isn't there also among some of the Jewish apocalyptic literature a suggestion that Ham, perhaps, maybe he found one of those books from that library that Dr. I.D.E. Thomas had talked about in the Omega Conspiracy?
I can't remember if it's the book of Jasher or the book of Jubilees talks about it, and it's either Ham or a son of Noah that's not even listed in the Bible, that they had found the writings of the Watchers and had begun to utilize it. And so the possibility goes either way. What is very obvious is that this family line began to move in esoteric knowledge that God was trying to wipe out with the flood and begin to reestablish what the Watchers were doing in the earth.
Yeah. Now, by the way, this raises another question. For people that have studied this issue, they come across the Sethite point of view, and then there is what's called the angel theory. Explain those two different worldviews and what the relationship of those views is with the research that you've done in the Shinar Directive.
When you put both theories back into their historical view, all of the rabbis, all of the ante-Nicene fathers all believed in angel incursion. It wasn't until the 5th century that a Roman Catholic apologist came up with what is known as the Sethite theory. And it was because instead of using Genesis 6 to actually defend the gospel and defend these things, he was ill-equipped, that he had to formulate a theory that would diffuse what the pagans were saying, that Jesus was just simply another version of Tammuz. And it was hard for him to do that because the Catholic Church had already infused those things into their theology. So because he wasn't biblical, he had to create this other theory. But none of the early church fathers, there was no rabbi on record that ever had even hinted of the Sethite theory until the 5th century AD.
Right, and so when you read the writings of the early church fathers, they talk about the giants as if this was just a commonly known fact, and that the giants arrived on earth as a result of fallen angels mating with humans and giving birth to these hybrids. And I also read one time where the church around the 5th century was trying to become more science-based. They were trying to be more sophisticated. They wanted to get away essentially from the idea of miracles and angels and demons and all of that. So they hated this idea that angels had somehow commingled with women and gave birth to giants. So they're trying to be more sophisticated, right? It's that human level of knowledge that wants to strip the divinity from the original text.
And the only other thing that Julius Africanus left us was he said that Jesus was supposed to come back in the year 1000. So look at his track record.
Yeah. Well, there you go with making predictions about the second coming of Jesus Christ, right?
That's right.
But let's stay on this for a moment because what happened in Genesis 6 is also connected to the character who is the central player in this book, Nimrod, right? The book of Genesis, you write about some things in here that's very interesting. Genesis 10, where it says some very peculiar things about Nimrod. Tell us about that.
You know, it's almost a footnote in history. It simply says that, Nimrod was born, he became to be a mighty hunter and lord, he began to be a mighty man, and it repeats it several times. And first of all, that word he began is halal in the original Hebrew. And in it can mean began, but it also means to corrupt, to defile, to prostitute. He did something that corrupted himself. And then it goes on to say that he became to be a Gibborim. When you look at the principle of first mention, back in Genesis 6, where it talks about the Nephilim, they begin to be mighty men of renown on the earth. That is the first time that Gibborim is used in the Word of God. So the very definition of a mighty man is a Nephilim. And so the second mention is with Nimrod. And it's not only that way in the Word of God, because, David's men were called Gibborim because they were able to do mighty exploits like the original Nephilim, the supernatural and the power of God. Even within Greek mythology, it carried that same thing. So Nimrod did something that corrupted himself. And even the rabbis knew the direction that really Moses was trying to hint here. The Septuagint literally says, and Nimrod became a giant. But I also found out that within that word halal, when you look at its various tenses, it also means to be run through or pierced through to the point of death. And we know that the Antichrist is going to be run through. He's going to have this mortal wound, but when he comes back, he's going to become something else. And then the third tense of that word actually is connected to the god Pan because it's to play a flute. And so we see in Nimrod, he started out as a man. Something happened. He was able to do something that not even the Watchers could do. He started out fully human and transmorgified himself into becoming a Nephilim. And we're going to see the Antichrist is going to start out as a man, has a mortal wound in his head. They're going to use some transhumanist technique to bring him back. And when they do, Apollyon is going to inhabit perdition and all of a sudden we see the full manifestation of the Antichrist. That's all encoded in that one word where he began to be a mighty man.
Now, you raised this word, Apollyon. The book of Revelation, the beast rises up out of the bottomless pit and goes into perdition, Apollyon, Apolia. The Apostle Paul uses that reference too when talking about the Antichrist. He says he'll be the son of perdition. That's the word Apolia, Apollyon. And we would want people to understand that Apollo is the Greek name of a mythological deity, a demigod. But if you follow that history backwards, essentially they're talking about this same mighty hunter, this same character that in the Bible is called Nimrod. The Sumerians refer to him as Gilgamesh. The Egyptians deified him as Osiris, the mighty hunter. But in the Bible, we find out that that spirit, whatever that is going to literally come up out of the bottomless pit and go into this man who's already on the earth. So what you just said was, he's what? He's on Earth. I mean, he's just got all the answers to all the political ailments of planet Earth. He's a genius. The world's in love with him. He's probably very charismatic. He's probably handsome. He's probably got degrees in science and tech, and he's all that in the Diet Coke too, as the young people say,
Absolutely,
right?
yeah.
But then something's going to happen to him, and what you're postulating is you think it's at that moment his deadly head wound is healed, and this is some kind of new genetic therapy. Is that something kind of like what happened with Nimrod? We don't really know, but what you're saying is that it's all implied in the text. He began to be. And the language halal, if I'm saying it correctly, can also imply something genetic.
Yes.
Now, when I've tried to kind of wrap my mind around how complex that line of thinking is, I've related it back to myself. I was born, and in my genetic makeup, I had the gene that can lead to diabetes, right? Mm-hmm. Now, you can have that genotype and not necessarily develop diabetes, but because I wasn't eating, people look at me and they think, oh, it's because he was overeating too much cake, right? And that wasn't the case. I was actually getting up in the morning and not eating at all until late into the afternoon because I'd get too busy, didn't want to stop and eat. And I'm throwing my blood sugar all over the place, and my doctor says he thinks that's what happened that then caused the genetic trigger. Mm-hmm. And all I can tell you is that now, by the way, I have this all under control now, but from that day forward, it started changing me in very powerful genetic ways. I wasn't a diabetic, but then I began to be. And that was how I kind of wrapped my mind around Nimrod, that perhaps there was some disposition in his genetic makeup, and given the occult knowledge that now is coming from Ham into this family, he starts making intentional efforts to defy God or something, and it sets his brain chemistry. I mean, I don't want to I don't want to try.
All that's there because he did something, and it says, he was the mighty hunter before the Lord. That literally means in Hebrew, he got in God's face to do it. Once he became a Gibborim, he did it. Now, what we don't understand is the occult for centuries, they'll use meditation, diet, and many different practices. They believe that they've been able to turn on and off various DNA switches in our genetic code. But I actually believe that our DNA is more than what we are physically. I believe that our mental characteristics, our personality type, even our spirit is encoded into our DNA. Harvard University recently found out that there is an antenna array built on the outside of your DNA. Mm-hmm. And that's you're wired from your DNA on up to be able to pick up the voice of God.
Wow.
And so it's all encoded. So when he corrupted his flesh, he corrupted his mind and he corrupted his spirit. And he removed the image of God that was within him.
That brings so much kind of new meaning to phrases like when Jesus would say, my sheep know my voice, and a stranger they will not follow. They're tuned in. Their antenna is tuned in to pick up the signal, but you could turn the signal off. Very interesting. Let's stay on Nimrod here for a moment, because the other thing that I found to be intriguing is how, when Nimrod began to be a Gibborim, and you're right, in the Septuagint it literally is saying he started turning into a giant. He started becoming a genetic mutation. He immediately then starts doing something that you would only ascribe really to angelic knowledge, even if it's fallen angelic knowledge. After that, he immediately goes to a place and he starts this, the Shinar Directive. he starts building a tower. So let's talk about that now for a moment, because how would he know where to go and build a tower so that the top of it could penetrate Shemayim?
I think that the occult have known for years there are places on planet Earth, whether it's the 10 vortices I talk about in the book, that there are almost dimensional portals. Maybe there was a weak spot in that veil that separates the dimensional realities. But what fascinated me, I originally thought, okay, they have a valley, they're building a tower. Until I did this research, I didn't realize that city had a 400-foot wall around it that was big enough to have chariot races, that it was 200 miles square, and that he had 12 palaces. He was trying to rebuild Atlantis, and I believe when he was building that tower, it's not about height. It's about, there was a weak spot maybe in the dimensional veil there, and he was building a dimensional portal so that they could storm heaven. In his war against God, it was not just enough for him to draw all men to him instead of from God. He was going to use all those that he drew and corrupted in his battle against God in heaven.
Well, what your book also made me wonder is if he started changing, becoming a Gibborim, becoming what was a fallen, part of it, a fallen angelic mutation.
Yes.
A blend, a hybrid offspring that was so unlawful that God, who is described even in the Old Testament as not willing that any should perish, even made sure that Israel developed opportunity for non-Jews to come in and to become part of the family of God. This God who would go out of his way to do all of that, when it came to the Nephilim, there was absolutely no grace whatsoever. If you see a Nephilim, you kill it, and it cannot be redeemed. It cannot be saved. The Rapha, as they are described, in the Bible, they can't rise from the dead. They won't be part of the resurrection. Now, they might be able to take on some kind of materiality, but they're not going to take part in the second resurrection. So all this very strange kind of absolutism in this language about their damnation. Of course, the extra-biblical book of Enoch goes into a lot of detail around that. They pled with God that their children, the fallen watchers pled with God that their Nephilim children could be redeemed, and no redemption's found for them.
But why? Going through back systematic theology, every once in a while I'll go through a good systematic theology just to make sure that Mike Lake's staying on track. And in R.T. Kendall's systematic theology, he made this statement. He said that within man there was the image of God. Although it was corrupt, it gave man his conscience. And so out of all creation, only man was created in the image of God. That's why he was able to have conscience. He was pricked to repentance and be able to be, man had the ability to be redeemed because he could repent. No angel has that ability. And so there was something about the Nephilim that when you became a Nephilim, it removed the image of God, and maybe it replaced it with the image of the beast. And because of that, they were unredeemable because they would never be able to come to repentance.
You made me think, if he's changing genetically, if he's becoming Gibborim, if he's becoming part of the fallen offspring of the offspring of fallen angels, maybe he took on watcher propensities, which as angels would be able to see through those dimensional veils that you're talking about. And maybe that's why he went specifically into the land of the plains of Shinar to build that tower, because maybe he could see what you're calling that weakness in that veil. One other thing I want to say about this, in the first program we did, you briefly mentioned parallel realities, parallel universes, and as our understanding of quantum physics and theoretical physics advances and things, maybe we'll talk about CERN in a little while, things that are happening, we're starting to realize that there could be evidence now that we're picking up where something is resonating from a parallel reality that seems to affect our reality, and yet it's invisible to us, even if maybe it's literally occupying the same airspace, but our eyes don't pick up the frequency. We don't see it. We're not aware of it. Now, this sounds like angels and demons and God, and and probably really good reasons why our mind in this current condition can't see those realities. I'm not sure if we'd be able to, to be able to take what we would see. But the Tower of Babel, because what you talk about in the Shinar Directive is what you said a moment ago. It wasn't just height. He wasn't just building a great big tower so he could get on top of it and shake his fist at God. This had something to do, kind of like a high level of angelic technological capacity was going on there that would allow some kind of resonation, something that would allow entering into that other reality.
Absolutely. And whether he was able to incorporate Watcher DNA into him, or simply the blending of species, because we know that animals can see things that we can't. That's why witches love to have cats, because they can see the spirits. It tells them when their familiars are there. And so whether he was able to blend animal DNA or Watcher DNA, but he knew that that valley was specifically strategic to what he wanted to do. And he knew that if he built the tower and completed it, that he would be able to access heaven. And even God said anything they put in their heart, they were able to do.
Right. Well, what did they imagine to do? To build a tower whose top would reach into the dwelling of God, Shamayim, and God says they will accomplish what they've set out to do. So he goes down, and you deal with all of that too, you know, why he confused the languages, what happened at Babel, but then of course the mystery religions, how they picked up some of these themes. Man, there's just so much here. Well, folks, we've got 6 minutes left in this. This is the second one, and I really thought we would take time to get into the meat of it. Maybe we're going to have to do another program. If you want to get a copy of the Shinar Directive, we are so just barely scratching the surface on this conversation right now. You can do that for $19.95. You should have a phone number there on your television screen that you could call if you prefer to do that. It also comes with a data DVD library. There's over 100 books that is in the data DVD library. There's 39 hours of seminars that Dr. Lake has hosted at different locations throughout the United States. There's Bible software for studying programs that's on the data DVD. In addition to that, we're giving you Mark A. Flynn's brand new book, The Forbidden Secrets of the Labyrinth. We're giving you Zenith 2016, which is, of course, my book. And a lot of people have said that this is probably my magnum opus, probably the best book I ever wrote. And then we're giving you a book that hasn't even been officially released yet, Terry James's brand new book, Antichrist Chronicles, Unveiling the Rise of the Earth's Final Furor. We picked these books and this data DVD library on purpose because they so complement the work that you've done in this book, the Shinar Directive. And when you put them all together and study them back to back, you probably get the most complete picture of this ancient conspiracy that was born really in the plains of Shinar and gave birth to the Babylonian mystery religions, which we haven't even talked about, but the role that of course then also plays in modern day occultism and the belief by some of the most powerful occultists on earth. We're talking the 33rd degree level and higher among the Masonic, among the Rosicrucians, and other occultists who believe and are dedicated to seeing the return of the golden age, as it is prophesied on the Great Seal of the United States. "'Tis thine own Apollo reigns," the Kume Sibyl said. The return of Apollo, the return of Nimrod, is on the Great Seal of the United States of America. But it was born back there when this rascal started building the Tower of Babel to defy God himself. Now, here's a question that I could imagine people watching this program today wondering, well, is it biblical to even think that there are strategic locations on the earth where that one place might be a place where angels, both fallen and unfallen, can ascend and descend? And yet that is a biblical premise, isn't it?
Jacob found one. We call it Jacob's ladder, that when he fell asleep there, he had a dream that there was a dimensional portal there, that angels were ascending and descending, and it so moved him that he built an altar in that place. And so it's very biblical, and in fact, there's other ones that kind of escapes my mind right now where they are, but there are many of them that we see that there are certain places where God comes to visit. In fact, some places he puts his signature. When you enter into a Jewish home, there's a mezuzah that has a sheen on it. When you look at the mountain range in Jerusalem, there's literally a sheen written in the mountain range of Jerusalem. So God is saying, this place there is a portal that I will come and visit with you at.
Right. And of course, the Watchers came down on Mount Hermon, and that's to this day known as a forbidden place. The very language around it implies that it was a specific location that these angels descended down out of heaven onto that mountain. And for a long time, the Greeks, you mentioned Pan earlier in his flute, the Greeks had dedicatories there. Where the demon god Pan would be worshipped, and yet when Jesus was in Caesarea Philippi, he was right there with an eyesight range of those little temples carved into the mountain face there to Pan, and that's where he said to his disciples, "The gates of hell will not prevail against my church." And part of what you're doing with this work is building a cause. To wake up the remnant, to make them know that there might be gateways all over the earth. In fact, we're probably going to have you come back. We're going to run out of time. We probably ought to pick this up and do another show if you're willing to. But you're wanting them to understand what Jesus meant when he said the gates of hell will not prevail against my church. We've got about 1 minute left. How do you want to close this show? What do you want to tell us?
Although the devil's getting ready to open up portals, so is heaven. Our greatest hour is upon us if we just press into God. I think God is going to awaken things in us that we never dreamed possible. It's time for the church to become that church without spot and wrinkle and give the devil hell before we get out of here.
Well, I think that's something that we could all say amen to. Once again, get your copy of the Shinar Directive so that you can read the fascinating research, actually, that you've done in this book. You know, I'm a student of the Word and a student of history, and I learned all kinds of things in this book that I didn't know, and until now I thought that I had actually written one of the books on the subject matter, and now it needs to be edited and improved, or as we're doing here, simply give it away with your work as well. Well, Dr. Lake, it's been wonderful talking to you for these first 2 shows. We're going to do a third one. And what do you want to talk about when we come back in this next program?
I think connecting the dots of the time that we're in and then the awakening of the remnant.
All right. Well, folks, thank you for joining us. And again, remember, keep watching Skywatch Television. Why are we Sky Watchers? Because we believe in the imminent coming of Jesus Christ, and we want you to be ready to meet him too.